Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, Chris joins me, and we're mainly going to discuss web components today and why they kind of may or may not be useful. But before we get to that, Chris, could you maybe just give me a brief overview on kind of what your tech journey has looked like so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm kind of unknown on the web as the vanilla JS guy. I actually came into this field, I think it's been about 10 years ago now. Used to work in HR, was dabbling in web development on the side because I had an HR blog and I wanted to have a little bit more of a say over how it looked and what it did. I became so hooked on it that I ended up kind of starting this career transition out of HR into web dev. And early on, I would fail a lot of interviews around the JavaScript stuff. So I was great with HTML and CSS, really like failing hard on JavaScript. And this was before CSS and HTML had the cred that they do now. Like design systems weren't a thing people were talking about. So I started learning platform native JavaScript just as a way to get hired and kind of got hooked on it. And it's been really cool to watch the web platform evolve from you really can't do a lot of stuff without jQuery to browsers can do a ton of really cool stuff out of the box now.
Yeah, very cool. And I know we didn't discuss this beforehand, but I'd be really interested on how you kind of went through transitioning into tech. So it sounds like your background wasn't computer science. It wasn't kind of the traditional academic background. I'm the same way. My background is actually exercise science and personal training. So I come from something totally different as well. So do you have any advice for kind of someone, looking to transition into tech, or how did you go about doing it?
Yeah. I had a little bit of a cheat. So I, because I worked in HR, I kind of saw how the hiring process worked from the inside. And also my focus when I was in HR was on career development and career planning for software engineers. So I kind of I saw how that whole thing worked. But there's a couple of things. The biggest thing that helped me, I used to call them coffee chats back when people used to actually hang out in person. But the basic premise is you reach out to folks who are in jobs you think you might want or in companies that you think you might want to work for. And usually they're strangers. They could be people you know. But you just send them a message that asks if you could just chat with them for 15 minutes to learn a little bit more about what they do. I'm thinking about switching careers or whatever it happens to be. And in those chats, you ask them, I usually ask 3 questions always. What is a day in the life like for you? What are the important skills that someone in this job needs to have? And what changes do you see happening that are going to affect the way this job works in the future? And from there, you usually can really quickly figure out, I'd like this job, I wouldn't. And if I would like it, here are the things I need to know if I want to do it. And the more important part here is it builds a really big network, because most jobs, by the time they hit a job board, hiring managers have already been interviewing people because that whole process takes a while. And so you see a job posted today and they might be on the final rounds of interviews already. So by growing your network, you can find out about these things ahead of time. You can get connected with people who could hire you. Just quick aside, if anybody kind of wants to learn more about this whole thing, I actually have a free guide on my website. So if you go to gomakethings.com/career guide, you can download that, and it's just jam-packed with all of the stuff I did to make this career journey.
I know for me, I kind of took the shotgun approach of just applying for tons and tons of jobs. And, after about 200 applications, I got about one interview and one job, and I kind of lucked out with that, in which it all kind of worked out. But I think taking a more kind of focused approach about growing your network and then, having someone maybe put in a good word for you for a certain application is definitely a better route to go. I think so anyways. So yeah, I think that's great. But to kind of transition into the topic of today's discussion, so web components. This is something that I personally don't have a ton of experience with. I've tended to focus more on JavaScript, React, Next.js, and kind of going into that kind of more framework approach. So I think a good place to start here is just what are web components?
Yeah, great question. So web components are a collection of native technologies that allow you to take a custom element and layer in some interactivity into it. rather than like if you think about traditional DOM manipulation, where you're targeting some element or collection of elements based on a selector of some sort, like an ID or a class or whatever. With a web component, you can create just like a really generic example, like let's say a count up button, right? Like the generic, like every framework has like as their demo, you click the button and it increases the number, right? So like with a web component, you could have a custom element in your UI called count-up. And then web components allow you to add a bunch of stuff to that. So you can hook event listeners onto it so that when it's clicked, things happen. You can render HTML into it. You can attach styling. You can bind data to it, similar to what you might do with like Vue or React. And then it also adds in some really cool features like, I say really cool, I'm going to talk about how I mostly hate them, but like things like the shadow DOM where you can completely encapsulate the HTML in that web component from the rest of the DOM so that you don't end up with naming conflicts, styling conflicts, etc. They've been around for a while. They haven't really clicked until very recently. I'd say like honestly within the last month or so, interest has started to peak in them again, even though they've been around for quite a while and have been used in a lot of large design systems for a while. So like Salesforce has been using web components for ages.
And why do you think that transition has now occurred? Because I know I've personally heard of them before, even back when I was learning to code a handful of years ago. I feel like web components is something I was hearing about, but they never kind of came to fruition. To me, it almost feels like similar to like WebAssembly, where it's like, oh, you can write any language in the browser. That's been a promise the last like 10 years. So why do you think the transition has occurred now to where they're kind of gaining more popularity the last couple months?
Yeah. So I think the big problem with web components historically has been, I guess it's been a combination of tech and marketing. And the tech hasn't really changed. It's more been about the way people, I think about them or conceptualize them. So when they first came out, I don't know if this was the intent of kind of the browser vendors or just the way people kind of latched onto the idea. But a lot of folks were looking at them like, okay, these will replace React components or Vue components, just my library components. And so people would come into them with that kind of mindset of this is going to be an entirely encapsulated single file style plus HTML drop in anywhere kind of thing. And they can do that, but especially in a framework ecosystem, they do it worse, right? So there's no browser native way to, if you're doing any sort of interactivity in there's no browser native way to just say, here's what this should look like, figure out what needs to change. You're still doing manual DOM manipulation inside them. And so if I'm using React, I'm probably better served just grabbing a React component than using a web component. So it's like, I think people were treating them like library components, but they did everything those things do worse, right? And the big shift has been, recently, I've seen a lot of folks discovering that you can use them as a wrapper to progressively enhance existing HTML rather than, okay, this is like a library type thing where all of the HTML is rendered and controlled by the JavaScript. You can still do that, and that has its place. But I think where they really shine is as a way to progressively enhance and scope interactivity around existing HTML. So like a really good example, I shouldn't say a really good example, an okay example, right? Might be, let's say you have a list of just like an anchor list of stuff, right? So you've got a bunch of links that point to some content further down on the page, and you want to turn that into a toggle tab type navigation, right? So this is great because if the JavaScript doesn't load, you've still got some perfectly functional HTML on the page. But you could slap a toggle dash tab. Web components always need to have a dash in their name. It's how they distinguish them from platform native ones. So you could throw a toggle tab custom element around that. And then when the JavaScript loads, it enhances that into toggle tabs, doing all the same stuff you would normally do with traditional DOM manipulation. You could even slap some sort of light framework in there if you really wanted to handle kind of some of the toggling. But what makes them nice for this application, because the argument I always get is, well, you could always do that. You don't need like a wrapper around that. You just slap like an element with an ID and do the same thing. Where web components really shine is under the hood, you create them using the custom elements define method and a JavaScript class that extends the HTML element object. And because you have a class with a constructor in it, you can do things like bind data directly to that element really easily, just by using the this keyword inside your constructor. You can scope all of your searches inside that element really, really easily. You can attach event listeners to things really easily. You get built-in garbage collection if the element ever goes away. And there's also some really nice built-in methods for doing things like detecting attribute changes on the element and reacting to them, or detecting when the element has been attached or removed from the DOM. There's some methods built into that class that just do things like that for you. So it's not that you couldn't do this stuff before. It's just the authoring experience is really, really nice. And as a nice side effect, because you have a custom element and not just some like random ID or selector, it becomes much easier to look at your HTML and know what's happening just based on the elements that are in there, right? Like if I see a toggle tab element wrapped around a thing, I can probably intuit from looking at that, okay, this is a toggle tab component. It's gonna enhance into something different. People are starting to call this way of authoring HTML web components, which web components are inherently HTML, so it maybe feels a little bit redundant, but I think the intent there is to distinguish like you're enhancing existing HTML rather than like a JavaScript web component where you're creating all the stuff from scratch.
Right. And I think that's probably a common question, is like, how are web components different from like React.js components or other libraries that use this kind of component mental model? But to me, it sounds like they're definitely very kind of separate things, to where web components, it sounds like one of the primary benefits to using those over something like a React component is the progressive enhancement side of things. So for one, is that correct? And then maybe for two, if someone's not familiar with progressive enhancement, like why is that a thing that people should want? Why is that something that's beneficial in the first place?
Yeah, no, these are great questions. So there's a few benefits. So one of them is portability. So if I have a web component, even if it's like the kind where I'm just dropping an empty custom element and JavaScript is rendering everything, where I think they win is portability. So with a React library, you get some pretty extreme vendor lock-in, right? So if I want to migrate away from React, I need to find components in a different tool to replace the things I already have. And I would expect there will be some HTML refactoring in a migration, but you really, you're kind of locked into using, you've got all these things you need to replace now. Where web components, because they're platform native, you can use them in React, you can use them in Vue, you can use them in any library of your choice. But you can also use them without any library at all. So you end up with a lot less refactoring when you use them. Even if you use them in the context of an existing library, you can kind of drop them around to lots of different cases or places. And if you're, let's say you're working at a company where you have a lot of different teams that use a lot of different tech. Like I've been at companies that have like 3 or 4 different products, and one team uses Vue, one uses React, one renders like flat HTML with PHP, that kind of thing. If I'm like, let's say, building a design system that I want used across the company, web components allow me to make sure that that system can be dropped into any tool anybody in the company is using versus having to make 3 or 4 separate kind of implementations for different use cases. So that's one benefit. The other one, you mentioned the progressive enhancement piece. So for folks who aren't familiar with that, the idea is that rather than having things in your site that only work when the JavaScript is loaded, as much as possible, you want to have things that have a somewhat usable bare bones state and then get improved in some way when JavaScript comes into place. So, an example, we talked about maybe the toggle tabs before. An accordion might be another example where by default, maybe I just have a collection of headings and content that goes with them. And then once my JavaScript loads, that gets enhanced into a bunch of collapsed elements that can be expanded out. So the reason why this matters is we're shipping so much JavaScript these days, and sometimes it breaks, but even when it doesn't, a lot of people are on slow connections. And so while that JavaScript is loading, they can't use your app if it requires JavaScript to work. And so when you progressively enhance things, you allow people to interact with stuff, even if your JavaScript is taking a long time to run. Or like I've been in situations before where really aggressive firewalls will block JavaScript files from loading. I used to work at the company that owns RSA, and for security reasons, they had this really aggressive firewall. And I remember there was one site where like someone's JavaScript file was getting blocked by the firewall, which meant that I couldn't expand their collapsed navigation menu on their website, and I couldn't visit anything other than the homepage, right? I wasn't trying to block JavaScript. I wanted to use it. It's just, so progressive enhancement gets around limitations like that. That could be a whole separate episode, to be honest. We could talk about various strategies for that and when it is and isn't appropriate and et cetera.
Luckily, I have had a podcast on progressive enhancement, so I could direct them to that. That was couple months back. So
awesome. So if you haven't heard that one, go listen to that because that sounds
exactly
great.
Yeah, cool. Well, web components, they definitely sound very cool. I totally agree with kind of the portability aspect of things. As in my current professional application, we've got like this AI tool that we use some different languages for. Then we've got our main website that's in React, and the UI between those can be quite different, and you kind of go back and forth between different mental models when working between the two. And it sounds like web components could potentially be a way to solve that, where you can have a similar way to author your user interface without needing to jump back and forth between kind of these two things. And kind of with that, if someone's considering, kind of DOM manipulation libraries, you've mentioned that you think web components in particular are kind of the best route to go with that. I'm guessing it's due to some of the benefits that we've mentioned already, but is there anything else that you want to kind of expand on regarding kind of DOM manipulation libraries specifically and authoring those with web components?
Yeah, that's a great that's a great question. So one of the other things that I've really grown to love about web components, specifically for DOM manipulation libraries, is you don't have to run a bunch of instantiations. So like if you've ever worked with a library before where like to kick things off with your script, you need to new script name, and then maybe there's some sort of like a init method you need to run on there. So like like something like swiper, for example, right, for carousels, right? To get that going, you need to run new swiper, you pass in the selector for the element, you pass in your options, and I think that one auto inits, but some of them don't. Some of them have like another method you need to run after you create the object. And if you have more than one of this element on the page, you need to do that for every single one.
In our application that we use, we have multiple inits in like our root HTML file, like one's for Sentry IO, like monitoring and tracking. We need to init that right at the start. And then I think we also have ones maybe for Cognito and then kind of different things like that. So I totally see that in my day-to-day job. We do that multiple times in a script tag right with our HTML loads.
Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about then, where it can be a lot to maintain and to manage and to update. And web components are auto initializing. So when you have that custom element wrapper and you've got the file that sets up your web component, you don't have to do anything else. As long as that element is on the page, when it's attached to the DOM, it will auto initialize. When it's removed from the DOM, it will clean itself up. If you dynamically inject more of them later, like let's say you've got some JavaScript process, maybe even an SPA, right, where route changes, now you add these new elements. You don't have to worry about, how do I initialize these? How do I clean up these event listeners? It just works. You drop it in, it initializes. And you can control configuration. Some of them are set up so you can do it with JavaScript if you want to. But a lot of the configuring and setting options happens at the HTML level, where you're setting attributes that accept strings. They could accept a stringified JSON object if you really wanted to get fancy with it. But yeah, it just makes that whole experience of dropping elements onto a page and not having to think about things as much a lot easier. There's one place to manage that thing, and that's where you're putting it in the HTML. And it also makes me, as someone who then has to go back and maintain these things, it's very easy to go and look and be like, oh, okay, this is initializing. I'm going to use Swiper because they have a web component. This is initializing Swiper. These are the options on it. I don't have to go hunt down a separate JavaScript file to figure out, which one's targeting this one and what are the options here. It's all right there in the markup. So if you're someone who loves HTML, and I do just unapologetically love HTML, it is really, really nice to work with web components.
And I would say that a lot of people tend to reach for like JavaScript solutions as the first solution when they can often solve their problem with just basic HTML knowledge or even CSS. Like those two can go a really long ways without needing to ship tons and tons of JavaScript. So I really like that aspect of things. And one kind of thing that you mentioned there was like Swiper has a web component, which makes me kind of think of, okay, if I'm building a, full professional application, I'm using all these different, tools like Centria.io or Swiper or pulling in different things. How well are like web components supported by some of these other kind of packages? Do they generally have some sort of solution there? Or what does that kind of look like if you're wanting to use web components alongside some of these other kind of external tools or monitoring systems or different things like that?
Yeah. So I obviously can't speak to the whole ecosystem, but they are extremely well supported just in browsers generally, all the way back to like Safari 8 and stuff. But they, I know they integrate very well with all of the major state-based UI libraries or frameworks, as people like to call them. So if you're using Vue or React or Svelte or Astro, you can start using them today. In terms of other tooling, so like monitoring tools and continuous integration processes and things like that, I'm not 100% sure, like what every tool does and like what the requirements are there. But they do tie really nicely into a wide range of build processes. So, if you're using Rollup or ESBuild to compile your JavaScript, they're going to play really nicely with those. Because under the hood, it's just JavaScript methods and classes. So there's not really anything fancy going on there. Yeah, so it's one of those things. It's been around for a while. It's a shockingly mature technology. It's still, web components as a platform are still growing. So like some of the coolest functionality only works with the Shadow DOM right now, and there's been a lot of push to make some of the cooler things you can do with web components also work without Shadow DOM, because Shadow DOM solves one set of problems and then introduces a whole set of other ones. So there's a lot of folks who are like, hey, can we have those solutions for not working with a Shadow DOM too? So they're going to continue to evolve. But I think when you look at companies like Salesforce, Google uses web components quite a bit. When you look at some of the bigger organizations using them already today, it feels like a no-brainer to say that you can use them in large-scale applications and design systems without any major issues.
Very cool. And, for someone listening to this, we've definitely focused on a lot of the positives of web components and what they can do, why they're beneficial. Is there any particular reasons why someone shouldn't go the web components route? Like, is there a argument that exists out there that is, against web components and why you shouldn't use them, or anything that? So Ed, you're laughing, so I'm assuming there is.
Yeah. So I think the biggest use case or the biggest argument against them, it depends on your use case, right? So like if I have a large application already built in React, I wouldn't go and just migrate all those things to web components today. Working code is better than like perfect code. But the danger of breaking that, you don't want to risk that. But the other aspect here is there are certain things where so if I'm trying to build a component and there's a lot of dynamic stuff in it that's going to change based on state, some one or more pieces of data that are going to change over time, like you would find in a React app. because browsers do not have any sort of native DOM diffing method right now, you're either going to have to do a whole bunch of manual DOM manipulation, which can become a real pain depending on the size of your HTML and the depth of those changes. Or you're going to end up dropping some sort of state-based library into your web component to support that. And at that point, in my opinion, you've kind of defeated the benefits that come with using a web component in the first place, and you might as well just use a native, whatever that library is, component instead. So there are absolutely situations where I think these types of libraries aren't particularly beneficial. And web components are also specifically DOM libraries. So, if you have stuff that like they're utility libraries, or they're doing like complex conversions, or like I'm thinking like Dinero.js that does currency conversions, right? Like you wouldn't ever use a web component for that. That's just not what those libraries are. Something like Lodash, it's not going to replace those. So it's one of those like right tool for the right job kind of situations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's true for most technologies in web development. Like I think often people reach for the tool that they know and understand the best, when often it's, not the best tool. And, I'm sure there's situations to where, hey, maybe a single page client-side React application is best for this situation. But I think often people reach for that when they could have just done something much more native, much more progressively enhanced, maybe using web components or something like that. So I think it's good to, have a balanced approach and really consider what technology is best for this specific use case. So kind of with that, Chris, maybe it's just one final question here. If someone is like, hey, this web components thing sounds really cool, I want to kind of dip my toe in the water and get started with it, do you have any recommendations on where they could kind of start learning web components and learn more about them?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you head over to gomakethings.com/code Ryan, I've actually put together a bunch of resources related to web components, progressive enhancement, and some switching career stuff, since we talked about that at the beginning of the episode, where folks can dig a lot deeper. So some stuff I've written, some links out to some other resources that you might find useful. And that would be a great place to start.
Perfect. Well, I will definitely have that linked in the description below. And is there anywhere else that people should be looking out to find you or follow you online or anything? Or is it mainly your website there?
Yeah, if you head over to gomakethings.com, that's my home on the internet. So you can find links to all of my other stuff. You can find me on Mastodon. You can send me an email to tell me that web components are stupid if you want. That's a
yeah,
great place to do that too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Chris. I know, web components, like I said, are a pretty new kind of subject to me, but this gave me a much better understanding of them and is now something I want to go explore more. And I'll probably go to gomakethings.com and go check it out. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. This was great.